Welcome back to part 2 of our discussion of DeWitt's chapter 29, along with an excerpt from Darwin that I asked you to read. This is a presentation of the basic ideas of evolution and sort of undoing some confusions about what evolution says and how it works. So we're going to talk about a couple confusions that DeWitt does not talk about, just to clarify for the final exam. Stuff that's in the book that I don't talk about is not your responsibility for the exam, but stuff that's not in the book that I do talk about thereby becomes your responsibility for the exam. Hopefully that strikes you as a basically fair bargain. There is an ineliminable and essential role of chance in evolutionary theory. Evolution and quantum mechanics, among others, have an irreducible role for chance processes. And this is a fascinating bit of intellectual history. Prior to the 19th century, chance was largely thought to be a measure of ignorance. The idea that we could have something worth calling knowledge of chance processes or statistical knowledge was laboriously acquired. It's a fascinating bit of history of the sciences and our concepts of knowledge and evidence, not your problem for a 100 level class. But there are people who equate evolution and chance, and that's lazy and misleading. In the pre-COVID era, there was a guy hanging out in front of the LSC, holding up a bunch of signs, making fun of the idea that a random process can generate complex organisms. And clearly by a random process, he means evolution. Is evolution a process that involves randomness? Yes. It does not follow from that it's a random process, unless you think that the opposite of fully intentionally goal-directed is random. But there's a ton of stuff in between. Evolution does not propose that a random process by itself generates complex organisms. The guy who's making fun of evolution would be right to make fun of it if that's what it said. But the selection procedure is highly non-random. It eliminates randomness, right? Lots and lots of randomly selected variations are disastrous for the organism that has them, or for the genes getting into the population. We'll go into some of those details later. And so you can have a process that randomly introduces possibilities. It's like making guesses in science. But a mere process of random guessing won't get you science. Maybe random guessing and testing. But of course, the selection process is where the testing happens. So it's just not fair, not true, to scoff at evolution as if it says that you could generate creatures like us purely at random. That is deeply, deeply misleading. Another charge is that evolution is just a theory. I propose that you ban that phrase from your vocabulary forever. It's not that it's false, but that it's misleading. It conveys heat but not light. Almost every view in science is, or at least involves, a theory. That doesn't mean that you can call things in science just a theory. Could any scientific theory be wrong? As far as I'm concerned, hell yes. If Newton could be wrong, anybody could be wrong. But from the mere fact that something could be wrong, you don't get to act as if it is wrong if you don't like it. We'll talk about evolution's connection to religion and ethics in DeWitt's final chapter next week. But right now, my point is just, if for whatever reason you don't like evolution, nevertheless, you don't get to dismiss it because it's just a theory. As far as I'm concerned, the human race could all have a brain cramp that makes 2 + 2 = 4 seem true when it's not. But unless you've got good reason to think it is the case that we're mistaken about 2 + 2 being 4, you can't just go around saying, oh, it's just a theory. Often, and this is a point to try to keep in mind anyway, our theories are better than our data. I've given this example from astronomy earlier in the semester. A good astronomer probably places a star no place she has ever seen it. She has a sophisticated mathematical function that goes from particular observations to a more accurate theoretical construct that corrects for the probable errors in the observations. And so when we say evolution is just a theory, you might have in mind something like string theory, which at least right now can't directly be tested and so is in some sense purely speculative. But relativity, which has been tested to death and is a fabulous theory, is still, scare quotes here, just a theory. So it's not really an objection to evolution to call it just a theory. I don't mind you reminding people that we could be wrong in anything we think. But it's one thing to say that we could be wrong and quite another to give a reason to think that we are wrong. Last common confusion before we talk through some details about evolution, it is not true that humans are descended from current apes. We share a common ancestor that is closer with some of the primates than with any other currently existing species. But that does not mean that we directly descended from chimpanzees or pygmy chimpanzees or gorillas or anything like that. They're just our closest relatives. It does not follow from their being our closest relatives that we descended from them. Much less that there should be missing links between currently existing great apes and us. There's just all kinds of confusions that people fall into here. DeWitt has a lengthy discussion of the historical side of evolutionary biology. Fascinating stuff here. Darwin and Wallace are in some important ways parallel with Newton and Leibniz. The calculus was invented because the world was ready for it. Evolution was invented in part because the world was ready for it. Doesn't mean that you didn't need big-brained people like Darwin and Wallace on the one hand and Newton and Leibniz on the other to bring all that home. So that's an interesting aspect of discussion about scientific progress. Arguably, had it not been Darwin, it would have been Wallace. Had it not been Newton, it would have been Leibniz, and vice versa. But there are other parts of the history of science, like the great accident of Brahe's data falling into Kepler's hands when Brahe died, that look much more accidental. So that's something worth thinking about, how much necessity or inexorability you think you find in the historical record of science. Last thing I'll say about this is DeWitt nicely brings out that Wallace did not have the kind of connections or money or other advantages that Darwin had. That's what a school like CSU is all about. The founding idea behind land-grant universities is to make world-class education available to people who generally don't have the means or the social standing to achieve those things. That's something that we should all be proud of in an institution like this. And the kind of success Wallace had is something worth striving for to at least some extent. Now, our story in biology is largely separate from our story in physics, but Aristotle looms as the essential background for both. Within the Aristotelian framework, and Aristotle arguably loved biology more than he loved physics, species function kind of like elements in the periodic table. They have unchanging essences. There can be some variation in accidental qualities, but a species is a fundamental natural kind. And members of different species are fundamentally different from members of other species, whereas Darwin sees continuity between species and variation within species. And so instead of separate kinds of things, Darwin sees the kinds as more connected than Aristotle had, and within each kind he sees more variation than Aristotle did. Quick note that I won't be able to go into, but those of you who are life sciences majors might be interested in, the philosophy behind the notion of species is intriguing and complicated. The idea of species membership that you probably got taught in high school, the biological species concept, says that two organisms are conspecifics if they can mate and produce fertile offspring. There are 99 problems with that, starting with the fact that many, many species reproduce asexually, and so the biological species concept doesn't even begin to apply to them. So I mentioned this as an example of where philosophy can bring conceptual clarification to other disciplines. All right, I'm going to keep this short, wind this one down, and we'll have a very short third lecture on DeWitt's chapter 29. Thanks as always for hanging in there.